significance of our spiritual convictions as a strength and value in daily living. We remember how men have fought for their beliefs, have struggled for the rights of spiritual strength, just as they have struggled for the right of economic or political liberty. We also realize that from the earliest time, religion has not only been a dominant force in the life of people, it has also been under almost constant persecution in some form or other. In ages of disbelief or unbelief, it was persecuted by those seeking to discredit its values. In other periods, religion persecuted religion. The faiths of men were locked in a terrible struggle for the dominance of theological concepts. Yet through all this diversified tribulation, faith has still remained the most powerful force in the life of the human being. And we are quite ready to believe that to the degree that man loses faith, to that degree he loses security and strength in all of the projects of his living. In times of great prosperity, men drift away from the sense of need. But in adversity of one kind or another, they return, constantly aware that life without faith is weak in its core, lacking the securities and supports that are necessary for fullness of expression. We would think, therefore, that recognizing the essential value involved, we would either make a greater and more thorough study of our religious conviction, or else we would try more assiduously to apply it to the various needs of life. In this day, which is burdened so heavily with material problems, the time of nominal religion has passed, at least for this generation. Belief either must sustain or else it must be acknowledged as valueless to ourselves. There is no point whatever in a mild, non-utilitarian approach to faith. Either we need it and must use it, or else it is meaningless to us. We therefore watch people constantly, and we observe that religious ignorance is comparatively rare. There are very few persons who have not some concept of the value of spiritual fact. Yet the ability to apply these spiritual overtones to the immediate problem of the day remains terribly undeveloped. We are still not securing the strength of our faith. And we look around to try and find out why we live upon the surface of a spiritual conviction, which, did we live it more completely, would sustain us more completely through every decision that we have to make in daily conduct. And we cannot come to any conclusion but one, namely that the human being has not yet found the way to apply ideals directly to his own conduct. He can see why they should be applied. He can be almost envious of those who seem to be able to apply. He wishes that he could derive strength from conviction. and he probably feels that he does gain some strength. But in emergency, it is seldom totally sufficient. The need, therefore, for a more active, a more secure state of faith exists all over the world, not only among those of simple beliefs, but among the most advanced of the students of various specialized religious and philosophical systems. The need to put these values immediately to work is a pressing need. Perhaps the answer to this problem lies in the fact that religion, as a subject of study, as a basic value, may be termed a contemplative art. The individual who is unable to contemplate values will have great difficulty in using his religion. Religion cannot be merely an immediate affirmation followed by a full expression of application. Religion begins as a gradual enriching of the internal life of the person. And this enriching depends upon a contemplative procedure. Not long ago, one of our prominent educators pointed out that our word learning comes from an old Greek word which means leisure. Now that is one of the things that we have lost sight of. To us, learning is a frantic process. To us, living is a frantic process. And getting rich is the most frantic process of all. We are living, therefore, in a perpetual frenzy. We are either overwhelmingly busy doing what? No one seems to know. Or else we are overwhelmingly unoccupied, doing nothing so continuously that we are bored to distraction. But even in doing nothing, we proceed frantically. We do not accomplish negation gracefully, but with the same terrible insistency with which we do everything else. And because of the momentum, this peculiar vibratory pressure that is on us continuously, we waste more time than any other people in history. We waste by haste. We waste by overpressure. And we have come to mistake endless activity for accomplishment when it is not. The purpose of activity is to accomplish. An activity itself is no accomplishment in itself. It is exactly like learning also. To become learned is not important in itself. It is only the benefit of learning upon living that is important. The person who knows much and does little has gained very little. So leisure, or a contemplative condition, is very important to us. Yet at the same time, those who have spoken of the dignity of leisure are criticized by the hurried. We can conceive of leisure today only as time wasting. We are unfortunately unable to recognize the possibility of a rich, diversified leisure. We also are unable to recognize relief from responsibility as opportunity for leisure. To us, relief from responsibility is the end of life. When we are no longer under responsibility, there's nothing left for us to do but die genteelly. That all of these so-called negative things which cut us off from duty or burden, or relieve us from tasks which we have finished, these so-called negative occurrences are actually invitations to the contemplative life, for which man is particularly fitted in the closing third of his physical existence in time. Yet to us this leisure is not a blessing. It is a catastrophe. It only permits us to worry more and become more sorry for ourselves, instead of being an inspiration to the enrichment of our inner living. Thus, without a contemplative life, we have no real bridge between spiritual conviction and conduct. Without the strength of the gradual maturing of our internal sense of values, we have no resources with which to combat the encroachment of crassness or materiality or unpleasantness in our environment. So we do recognize this tremendous virtue of contemplative living, the absolute need that every person has for at least brief periods of being alone with self and finding this condition agreeable. If we cannot get along with ourselves pleasantly, that is probably the clue to our trouble with other people. For we may expect them to get along with us more amiably than we can endure our own association. And this will fail, because the beginning of our relation with others is the integration of our relation with ourselves. Now, our particular problem this morning is the factor of immortality. Can we experience this? Can we know it? Can we lift ourselves from certain doubts and uncertainties about our own future to a condition of greater internal security? So let us ask the first question. Immortality appears to the average human being as a great hope, as a great value. Just how valuable is immortality to us, unless we make certain changes within ourselves? How many persons really would like to go on forever the way they are now? Is the possibility of a continuance in eternity of the disposition we cannot get along with today, a continuance of the foolish mistakes which we daily and hourly make, the continuance of our self-pities and our fears and our worries and our anxieties? Would such continuance be a boon? Would it give us anything which we could look forward to without a measure of alarm or a certain sense of disaster? Actually, therefore, immortality as a belief is not essentially satisfactory unless it is coupled with or associated with other strong and positive values. We must, in order to experience this truly, have the real pressing sense of the value of continuance. Now, the value of continuance into eternity of a life which we do not value now, would again be an uncertain achievement. The individual who is only looking forward to the end of life as a release from boredom could hardly regard immortality as a benefit. Now, to meet this peculiar situation, we have various highly colored concepts of what immortality is like. Man, as a psychological being, has decided definitely that immortality as the continuance of the present state is not acceptable. Therefore, he has developed various concepts of paradisios and purgatorios to take care of this. In other words, the life before him in eternity must either be better or worse. It must not and cannot be the same. Obviously, we would have very little to look forward to if we really believed in the existence of a purgatorial state, such as the theologians of long ago so loudly proclaimed. Because according to their dicta, and according to their laws, rules, and the very concepts with which they framed these traditions, we would all be in them. Because for them, salvation was restricted to a very small group of special persons. On the other hand, the concept of the other world extending on into a magnificent vista of peace and glory and happiness violates every concept of reasonable and lawful procedure that we know. The individual, not having solved anything, cannot hope to proceed by the mystery of death into a state of solution. He must continue to be himself, and his future life, his immortality, as the Chinese point out, is acceptable only to the degree that it is necessary. The Egyptians held that immortality was reserved for those who needed it. We do not hold that thought today, but there is a certain point in it, from an ethical standpoint, that is highly intriguing. When the individual says here, I hate to lay down my instruments of labor, there is so much more to be done. There are so many things to learn, so many opportunities that I have never been able to avail myself of. There are so many who need my help. There are so many who need my presence and instruction. I regret that I have to cease these labors. Such a person, according to the Egyptian, would be a likely candidate for immortality. Why? Because he not only needs to live to fulfill his own instincts, but he desires to live. It is not an expectation, an acceptance of a doctrine which makes continuance inevitable. It is a voluntary statement of the desire and need to go on. The Egyptian pointed out that such was the type of person to whom the gods might well bestow this blessing, because to this person it would be a blessing. He wants to go on. He wants to grow. He wants to learn. Like Socrates, he goes forth to a great adventure of further becoming. But where is this adventure? Where is all of this? If the individual here and now is in the doldrums, has no interest in anything, no sincere desire to forget himself in the service of something greater, and really has nothing to live for even here, why then should this blessing be a blessing? Would it not be rather a heavy burden upon him? So in order to meet this emergency, almost all of your religious groups and your great philosophical systems have tried to impel the individual or inspire the individual to so live now that immortality would be a natural right, a proper continuance of a procedure already well established, the opportunity of the individual to see the future as the unfolding of useful and desired experience, not merely further twiddling of fingers somewhere in an infinite Elysian field. That there is no reason, no purpose in the individual attaining an extension of consciousness unless that extension is meaningful, purposeful, vital. We do not hold the old thought today. We assume the natural immortality of all things. But one thing we can take from the old philosophy, that is this very firm realization that whatever this continuance may be, it will be better if the individual is more purposeful. That if he has dreams and ideals, he then faces an opportunity for greater fulfillment. Whereas if he has none of these attitudes, he faces only continuance. And he can hardly endure that part of it which he now faces in this world. How then shall we say that man comes to the conviction of immortality? Man is bound in a very peculiar pattern. And one of his subconscious instincts seems to be that he realizes that he lives in a world in which all things that are necessary are available. Man observes nature's infinite economy, the wonderful way in which this life of ours is geared into numerous cycles and patterns. And man is convinced that nothing that he needs is unavailable to him. He must learn how to find what he needs, but it is somewhere available if his own understanding and his own consciousness can discover it. Therefore, the great need for immortality in the experience of the individual does a great deal to strengthen his belief in it. It gives him a sense of valid requirement. He makes his own proper request of nature by proving that his immortality will be of common good to himself and others. He therefore has the feeling, the expectancy within himself that this condition which he needs will not be absent from him. If he firmly, internally visualizes life, that this visualization is authentic, that it states to him something that is so, and that he can believe firmly that what his heart and conscience tell him, these things are true. True because they come from roots and sources deep within himself. Immortality must be discovered within the person, but there is certain valid testimony relating to it around him. For example, dependent as we are upon the testimonies of our sense perceptions, we live in a world of continual life, yet a world in which each creature seemingly and obviously passes through the mystery which we call death. Thus we can say that a collective such as our nation can continue for 200, 300, 500 years. And yet there is no citizen within the structure of this state who can endure for that length of time. Thus we have two kinds of mortality and two kinds of immortality. We have the mortality of nations, by which death is decreed to a political unit or to a social structure, or to a racial group. But this death is not decreed immediately, so that these people may live as a collective for 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years. Then we also have this other decreed fact that the individuals composing this compound may live only from 50 to perhaps 100 years as individuals. Thus we have two kinds of life: the life of a collective and the life of an individual. We also recognize that this life of the collective carries with it many archetypal forms. This life of the collective is not without a common consciousness of itself, that has a consciousness for its own language, for its own physical, biological peculiarities of color and temperament and bodily structure. It has a consciousness of its own arts, of its sciences, of its history and traditions, of its religions. These are all entities within the consciousness of the collective. So the motion of a race down through history is the motion of one valid structure of ideas. And in its 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 years of existence, a race passes from infancy to childhood, from childhood to adolescence, from adolescence to maturity, from maturity to age, and from age to dissolution. This long cycle is actually the story of the birth and growth and decline of a consciousness. And at any moment in this process, this consciousness is composed of the individual units which make up the people of a generation. So we have this compound approach to immortality visible to us. We become aware, therefore, that forms, patterns, personalities are forever changing, but principles, lives, concepts, ideals have a greater endurance and may pass through vast cycles of continuance, some of which we cannot fully estimate. We also then suddenly realize that the greatest cycle that we know is humanity and the human being. Humanity has been the unbroken descent of this creature we call man for millions of years. Safe to say that this descent in human form probably is not less than 5 to 10 million years old, probably longer. And yet, in this great descent of the collective, we find a stream of perishable individuals, so that individuals come and go, but man goes on, archetypally, basic. The great human unit moves victoriously along a way scattered with the death of individuals. We have the same problem in connection with the human body. Man as a human being has an endurance of 70, 80, 90 years. Yet there are no cells in the body, except perhaps a few of the most essential and deep-rooted of them, that has anything resembling such continuity. And there is an old belief, which is not so untrue, that every part of the human body is renewed and replaced every 7 years. So that every 7 years we have a new body, whether we know it or not. And every living part of that body has passed through a cycle of birth and growth and maturity and death. Yet we go on. Yet were we bound by our perspective to measure our own life by the cell in our body, we would be constantly in the presence of death. Yet this death does not interfere with the grand motion of our consciousness for a number of years, giving us our span of 60 or 80 years. In these patterns, then, we become aware that behind ever-changing life and death, there is a continuance which is valid, a continuance which ancient man recognized, and which he incorporated into his great religio-philosophical institutions. A continuance in consciousness which is not broken by the interlude of death as we know it. If therefore in every visible institution and structure that we know, death relates only to an expression, a manifestation, a part, and life relates totally and eternally to all, to the totality of things, then we must admit that death is an incident in the motion of life itself, that it is not an end, it is not a termination of life, but an incident, an episode, a moving and changing pattern within life, which is an unchanging and eternal state. Man, by contemplation, begins to experience these things within himself. And we must therefore stop for a moment and ask about the validity of the personal experience of a spiritual value. Those of materialistic mind are inclined to feel that a so-called spiritual experience is little better than a self-hypnosis, that the individual longing and desperately desiring to believe forces this belief upon himself, and that therefore his consolation in spiritual believing is merely the consolation of an acquired attitude with which he indoctrinates himself, coming in the end to believe that which he cannot demonstrate or prove simply by the strength of his own mental emotional pressure. His need, for example, causes him to formulate a solutional belief, which is solutional to him, but has no validity in space. This would be true and is true every day if the individual's faith or philosophy of life is based upon an aggressive self-indoctrination. There are persons every day who are accepting beliefs that are not so. And they are doing it because their own life is so poorly integrated, so completely lacking in depth and penetration, that they have no criterion whatever with which to measure the value of anything. And furthermore, they are accepting beliefs out of desperation. They are accepting something as man might cling to a piece of broken wreckage in a shipwreck. Anything that offers perhaps a hope or a chance. Thus man turns to his faith only because of his own extremity. And in this extremity, as he founders along, sinking and derelict in this sea of values, he will naturally cling to things which are immediate and which seem to offer some solution, especially without too much work on his own part. As opposed to this, however, is your contemplative religious life, in which the individual does not develop his convictions only in moments of emergency, but rather through the building of value reduces emergency. 90% of the emergencies which we pass through are not valid. A few maybe, because man simply does not as yet possess sufficient faculties with which to cope with everything that happens to him. But he does possess faculties which will cope with nearly everything, leaving only a very rare and extraordinary valid emergency. For the rest, his emergency is due merely to his own unwillingness to make living a personal responsibility, his definite effort to evade life and evade solution. These are what causes trouble. So instead of building our concept of value under the hypnotic tension of necessity, we must build it under the contemplative leisure, which has to do with our maturity as human beings. If through contemplative procedure man gradually permits value to move into his consciousness, he will find that his final conversion is not due to his mind converting the rest of him. Rather, it is due to the inner depths of his own nature converting his mind. Man as a being has the possibility of presenting to the mind itself an unsolvable riddle as far as mentality is concerned. I do not believe that the inner life of man can be solved by a totally rational procedure. Rationality, however, is the discipline by which man becomes capable of transcending the limitations of his own judgment. Without discipline, no one will ever achieve a true measure of internal understanding. And discipline is what bestows upon the person the opportunity for the tranquility of contemplative leisure. Discipline, for instance, can begin by placing the person in a pattern, self-determined, in which he arranges his affairs so that a certain amount of leisure is available to him, so that he does not tumble along through the day, merely a victim of the pressures of the moment, but approaches his problem with a plan. Discipline helps him to close the door of his office and come home without bringing his work home with him to worry about or to be fearful about. Discipline enables him to recognize the needs of certain rights and privileges which his body demands, and also his family requirements, his recreations, and all of these values. These he must achieve and maintain by discipline. The moment he begins to be indifferent to his own conduct, permitting excess to appear in some direction or other, whether it be the excess of idleness or the excess of overhaste. The moment excess destroys moderation, his contemplative life is ruined. So by contemplation, he gradually comes into a repose, a measure of tranquility, and begins to discover the tremendous potential strength of tranquility. He begins to discover that value is not always in the hectic accomplishment of something. It is in the ability to relax away from things and to find the dignity of quietude in relationship to value. In this way, through the gradual development of a leisure factor, man discovers that leisure is the beginning of learning, because through leisure, the individual has time, and time is an essence of contemplation in our way of life. Without some time, we cannot cultivate the mature interests of our lives. And in deciding only to devote our time to the attainment or acquirement of material activities, we destroy the leisure and contemplative part of our lives. Without this leisure, man's inner life remains a mystery to him. And as long as this mystery endures, he is weak. If then we can begin this contemplative procedure that gradually moves from within ourselves values which we cannot adequately define, but which require no definition. I would say that wherever anything moves from within ourselves because of pressure, because of emergency, it can be distorted. And there are many times in which the impulses and instincts from within ourselves are not valid. They are not valid because they are the product of ulterior pressure in ourselves. In desperation, in emergency, we call upon our internal resources, but we call upon something undeveloped. And most of all, we impose upon it immediately that it shall fulfill our desire. Thus, when we pray for what we want. We'll refuse to accept anything else. We'll demand and decree that what we want we shall have. And if we are in search of a believing at this time, we will impose upon ourselves that the thing we believe must be what we want to believe. It must be the fulfillment of a concept that justifies us. It must be the kind of internal conviction that is consistent with our demands upon life. Well, by the time we get through with all of these demands, all of these restrictions and reservations upon ourselves, what comes through is little better than a conditioned reflex. It seems to arise within ourselves, but it is nothing but the total statement of our own ignorance. It is merely our mind and our subconscious gratifying our objective consciousness, saying amen because it is not permitted to say anything else, agreeing because it must either agree or not be heard. And this type of message comes from a much lower level, for it is merely the coming out of our own frustrations. For the inner life of man is not merely a divine quality. It is also a tumbling ground for frustrations and neurotic pressures. If then, when we seek within ourselves, and we seek on the level of pressures, we are pressurefully demanding solution, we get pressureful solution. We get all these theories and all these believings that we have demanded. We do not get what is true. If, however, we enter into this communion with our inner life without imposing upon it ulterior motives of our own, if we are really truth-seeking and are not asking that the truth be what we expect it to be, but are perfectly willing to accept the divine purpose and abide by it, asking only to be shown enough so that we can keep the law and not make this law our servant. Gradually, through such an attitude, we begin to break down the psychotic errors, the psychic pressures, the psychosomatic tensions by which the internal vision of man is deformed. One of the reasons why we have so many difficulties in our religious life is that we have mistaken neurotic pressure for divine revelation. We do it individually. We have done it collectively. We have created powerful world movements upon what is nothing more or less than the neurosis of a brilliant person. And as a result, those who have followed these ideas have themselves become more and more involved in difficult patterns. And such organizations and such groups do not prevent war, they do not prevent discord, they do not overcome intolerance, because they are burdened with these things themselves. The pure stream of revelation, as referred to in the ancient writings, was not permitted to manifest itself. We insisted upon a revelation that matched and met our predetermination as to what it was going to be. And moving as we did from tension, we had no possibility of experiencing anything but a tense doctrine. I have known these things and watched them happen over periods of years. An individual with a natural tendency to intolerance presses upon his internal life, demanding support. And before he gets through, he has a complete revelation justifying intolerance, in fact, commanding it as a divine responsibility, not knowing that the whole pattern came out of himself. But he was sincerely convinced that his own attitudes were a full expression of the divine purpose. Searching within himself with this attitude, he found nothing but support for his own attitude, because nothing else would have been acceptable to him, nothing else would have been recognized. So if you go in toward yourself, inward, with preconception as to what you will find, you will always find what you expect. The Taoist philosophers of China realized this, and therefore said that the only way that we can find truth, either around us or within us, is to live totally without preconceived expectancy. The moment we expect nothing, the fact is available. The moment we truly depart from attempting to direct and determine the universal method, we become aware of the true working of that method. As long as we are looking for something, we will find nothing else. And unfortunately, we cannot look for a platitude. The individual says, I seek only truth. Yet he cannot define truth without conditioning it with his own attitudes. The pure, complete, impersonal substance of truth is inconceivable to him. Truth must therefore be the faith he was brought up in, or the faith he has accepted, or the result of his own experience, or his own empirical conclusion. Truth cannot be something completely separate and apart from his own attitude. Therefore, the search for truth is in most cases merely the search for self-justification. There is no other way we can pattern it. For these reasons and others similar, we find the validity of the Buddhistic attitude, namely that man, in order to discover true value in anything, must overcome the value-defining factor in himself. He must open himself to pure value. And to do this, he must cease conditioning value. Psychology will tell you that by certain catharsis, man can rid himself of the pressure of certain complexes. Unfortunately, however, he no more than rids himself of one before he develops another. For these are like the dragon whose heads multiplied as quickly as they were cut off. Consequently, it is almost impossible to conceive of a person whose internal life is completely without false pressures. Almost inconceivable that such a person could exist. Therefore, in philosophy, our primary purpose is to reduce as far as we can these false pressures by giving the individual a kind of outlook on life in which he is no longer limited by that kind of ignorance which makes him selfish, unkind, or self-pitying, jealous, hateful. Under the understanding that if we understand the universe well enough, we can no longer sustain our own unpleasant actions. We must outgrow them by understanding through them to something better. Always these reductions of pressure. If a man through his religion, his philosophy, or his scientific approach to life, or through his social contacts, through his business, through his family, whatever it may be, if a human being can, through these associations, learn to overcome hate, so that he no longer hates anything, a tremendous source of error within himself has been dissipated. He will then no longer desire or accept a God of hate. He will no longer believe that the fulfillment of his life depends upon the discomfiture of someone else. Nor can he any longer believe in these various dishonesties which arising from hate plague him continuously and cause him to resent living. If then by any means, contemplative or mystical, we reduce false values, we begin to experience a broader sense of true values. We know this is true in religion. We have a complete historical record of its truth. For we know that the faiths of primitive men who had less internal contemplative skill than we have were correspondingly literal. That in ancient times men worshipped much in fear, worshipped deities very much like their physical objective selves, worshipped a god who was little more than a tribal chieftain, because when they sought within themselves, these were the things they found, and they had to worship according to what they could experience. Man must always worship this way. Consequently, the increasing need for man to have a more valid experience. And he has resources today which will permit him to search within himself. And if he will develop his contemplative powers of leisure and tranquility, he can begin to experience the valid fact of a universal divine principle embodying the highest attributes of wisdom and love.